Everyone knows the glossy ads, the glamorous runways, the polished corporate slogans. But behind the logos of the world's most famous brands lie shadows few dare to explore. Stories of blood money, secret deals, and scandals buried under billions in profit. From suicide nets to death squads, from Nazi gold to Cold War submarines. This is the dark truth of global empires, where every product has a hidden price. Apple, the nets of despair. It's a humid night in Shenzhen. The rain taps steadily against the fog factory windows of Foxconn, the colossal complex where millions of iPhones are born. Inside, the fluorescent lights never turn off. Rows upon rows of young workers, heads bowed, hands moving in mechanical rhythm, soldering and assembling at speeds few outsiders could imagine. At 3 a.m., one of them slips away. He pushes open a rusted service door and climbs a metal stairwell toward the roof. His body is frail, worn down from 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. For a moment, he stands at the ledge, staring into the storm. Then he jumps, but he doesn't hit the ground. Instead, his body slams into a massive mesh net stretched across the side of the building. A net built not to protect workers from accidents, but to stop them from ending their lives. This was Apple's solution to a wave of suicides in the early 2010s, when young men and women working in Foxconn's factories leapt from rooftops in despair. And here's the question that still lingers. Why would one of the richest companies on Earth rather build giant nets than address the causes pushing people to suicide? At the time, Apple's iPhone had become the most coveted piece of technology on the planet. The sleek glass rectangle promised freedom, creativity, and status. But behind its glowing screen lay a grim truth. Workers lived in crowded dormitories, sometimes packed 12 to a room. Breaks were minimal. Shifts stretched so long that some employees fell asleep at their stations, jolted awake by supervisors. The suicides weren't isolated tragedies. They became an epidemic. Reports leaked of jumpers almost every month. Instead of pausing production, Foxconn took a brutal step, installing suicide nets, strung like spiderwebs across buildings. Executives framed them as a safety feature. But to the outside world, they became a haunting symbol of modern technology's human cost. Apple's public response? Silence, then carefully crafted statements about partner accountability and worker well-being. Yet insiders whispered a darker story. Workers claimed they were pressured into signing pledges, documents vowing they would not attempt suicide. Some alleged the contracts went further. If they did take their own lives, their families might lose the meager compensation provided by Foxconn. Imagine the despair of being trapped in a system where even death carried penalties. Could Apple have known about this? Some investigators say yes. Others argue the company turned a blind eye, so long as the conveyor belts never stopped and the iPhones kept shipping. There's another layer too, one rarely discussed. Conspiracy-minded critics point out how quickly news of the suicides was contained. Chinese state media softened coverage. Apple's marketing machine rolled on. Share prices climbed. Was there a hidden agreement between corporate and political powers to keep the truth buried beneath glossy ads? Years later, the suicide nets remain. Silent, metallic guardians stretched beneath factory windows. Thousands of workers still file past them every day on their way to the assembly line. A reminder that their despair has been anticipated, measured, and engineered against. And that haunting question refuses to fade. Why is it easier to build nets to catch falling bodies than to create conditions where people don't want to jump in the first place? Pepsi Soviet Navy. It's the mid-1970s in Moscow. Crystal chandeliers glow inside a grand Kremlin banquet hall. A long table is covered in crystal glasses, caviar, and bottles of vodka. At one end, Pepsi executives in sharp suits raise their glasses, smiling nervously. At the other, Soviet ministers toast back, their laughter booming, but their eyes watch closely. In the corners, KGB agents stand silent, their presence unmistakable. This isn't just a business deal, it's a Cold War performance. Every gesture, every sip of vodka carries political weight. The agreement being signed will become one of the strangest in corporate history. An American soda company cutting a deal with the Soviet Union. a superpower locked in ideological conflict with the United States. Pepsi wanted to expand globally. The USSR wanted Western luxuries but couldn't pay in US dollars because of trade restrictions. The solution seemed simple: barter. The Soviets would trade vodka in exchange for Pepsi concentrate. For a while it worked, but by the late 1980s, vodka exports could no longer cover the bill. So Moscow offered something extraordinary: military hardware, submarines, destroyers, and a fleet of old warships. In total, 17 naval vessels. Here's the first chilling question: why would the Soviet Union hand over its navy to a soft drink company? And how did Pepsi overnight become the temporary owner of what was briefly the world's sixth largest navy? Pepsi executives publicly brushed it off as a harmless barter arrangement. They insisted the vessels were destined for scrap. And officially, that's what happened. The ships were sold for parts, melted down into steel, and the profits flowed back to Pepsi. But the rumors have never gone away. Some whispered that not all of the submarines were dismantled. A handful may have been quietly resold on the black market, their weapons systems still intact. If true, Pepsi may have unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, helped arm rogue nations during one of the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. Consider the timing. These were years when the Soviet Union was desperate for hard currency. It was also a time when shadowy arms deals thrived in the gray zones between East and West. Intelligence agencies kept close watch on every shipment. Yet somehow, Pepsi's naval barter deal slid through without sparking outrage in Washington. Why? Some say the US government tolerated it because Pepsi's deal doubled as a diplomatic channel, a soft way to open doors in Moscow. Others believe the CIA itself may have monitored the transfers, curious to see where the vessels ended up. And then there's the darker theory, that some of those subs didn't vanish into scrapyards but sailed quietly into new harbors, sold off to buyers in the Middle East or Africa. If even one of those stories is true, Pepsi's Cold War adventure may have fueled conflicts far beyond what we'll ever read in glossy corporate histories. For a few surreal months, Pepsi, a soft drink brand, commanded a fleet more powerful than many small nations. Then just as quickly, it was gone. The ships disappeared, the papers were filed, and the deal faded into obscurity. But the story lingers as a bizarre Cold War footnote, raising unsettling questions. What really happened to those submarines? And how close did the world come to Pepsi? Not Coke, not Moscow, not Washington, tilting the balance of global power with a secret navy. Rolex, time and blood. It's Switzerland, 1943, neutral ground in a world consumed by war. Inside a discreet office in Geneva, a Nazi officer in polished boots slides a heavy bar of gold across a desk. Stamped on its surface, the Reich's eagle and swastika. On the other side, a Swiss watchmaker lifts a small box and opens it to reveal a gleaming Rolex. The trade is quick, silent, and final. One symbol of power exchanged for another. This is the shadowy world where luxury meets atrocity. Rolex, today known for elegance, prestige, and celebrity endorsements, was thriving during the Second World War. But in those years, its business wasn't just about watches, it was also about survival in a world where neutrality meant profit. Switzerland positioned itself as impartial. Banks, vaults, and trading houses filled with deposits from both sides. Officially, Rolex was just another company making sales. Unofficially, its clientele included officers of the Third Reich. The Nazis prized Rolex watches for their precision and prestige. They wore them as symbols of status, tokens of dominance carved in steel and ticking endlessly on their wrists. But here's the first question. Did Rolex's glittering success come, at least in part, from blood-stained gold? Historians have long debated whether companies like Rolex indirectly profited from Nazi-looted treasure. Gold ripped from occupied banks, melted down, and laundered through Swiss channels. Some of that gold may have been exchanged for watches, fine jewelry, or stashed in corporate accounts. The records are murky, but the silence from Rolex itself is deafening. The company's official narrative focuses on innovation and resilience. During the war, Rolex advertised its watches to Allied prisoners of war, promising they could buy on credit and pay later, an effort framed as humanitarian. But beneath that story lies a darker layer. Researchers digging through Swiss archives claim that hidden ledgers exist, documents never released publicly, that detail Rolex's wartime sales to Nazi officials. Among the alleged buyers, officers directly tied to concentration camps. If true, it means Rolex wasn't just passively selling watches in neutral Switzerland, it was actively supplying luxury goods to men orchestrating genocide. Which leads to the second question: why has the company kept these archives locked away for decades? The secrecy fuels speculation. Some argue Rolex fears reputational ruin if the truth emerges. Others suggest Swiss laws protecting banking and corporate confidentiality serve as a convenient shield. And then there are the conspiracy whispers that Rolex's wartime profits helped seed its post-war rise, turning Nazi gold into the foundation of modern luxury marketing. The company has never been forced to confront this past in court. Unlike banks or industrial giants dragged into reparations debates, Rolex remains largely untouched, its polished reputation intact. The image of glamour and timeless elegance eclipses the shadows of its history. Yet the image of that 1943 exchange remains haunting. A bar of looted gold, a watch ticking steadily toward midnight, and a silent pact between neutrality and complicity. Decades later, collectors still prize wartime Rolexes, some marked with engravings that trace back to German officers. These watches fetch millions at auction, celebrated as rare artifacts. Few pause to ask whose suffering financed their original purchase. And so the mystery lingers. Did Rolex simply serve customers in a neutral country? Or did it knowingly polish stolen treasure into the luxury of time? Watches that ticked while millions were marched to their deaths. Victoria's Secret, lingerie behind bars. It's late afternoon inside a U.S. women's prison. Fluorescent lights flicker overhead. The air hums with the clattering of sewing machines. Rows of inmates sit shoulder to shoulder, stitching lace and cotton under the eyes of patrolling guards. For their labor, they earn just 23 cents an hour. On the table in front of them, bras and lingerie destined for glossy storefronts with soft pink lighting and million-dollar ad campaigns. The contrast could not be sharper. Behind the fantasy of Victoria's Secret, glamorous models strutting down runways, lurks a world of forced labor and razor wire. The story begins in the 1990s when Victoria's Secret was transforming into a cultural juggernaut. Catalogs flooded American mailboxes, TV ads promised seduction, and annual fashion shows glittered with diamonds and angel wings. But behind the marketing, the company's supply chains stretched deep into America's prison system. In Ohio and other states, incarcerated women reported being ordered to cut, stitch, and package products for Victoria's Secret. Many weren't given a choice. Refusing the work could mean losing privileges, facing punishment, or solitary confinement. For pennies an hour, they made products that would later sell for $50 or more. Was Victoria's Secret's empire literally built on prison labor? Executives rarely addressed the issue. When evidence surfaced, they brushed it off as isolated contracts or denied direct involvement, blaming suppliers. But internal documents suggested a wider network. Prison workshops fed into subcontractors, who fed into major brands. The lingerie that graced supermodels on magazine covers may have passed through the hands of women serving time, women who had no say in the matter. And the whispers grew darker still. Rumors circulated that certain exclusive collections of lingerie were traced back to specific prison programs. Some former inmates swore they recognized their own stitching patterns in garments later sold nationwide. Yet whenever journalists probed too deeply, the evidence seemed to vanish. Suppliers closed ranks, records disappeared, the trail went cold. Could luxury lingerie still be tainted with this past? Consider the timing. The 1990s were years when the U.S. prison population exploded, fueled by tough on-crime laws. Private companies struck deals with states to profit off prison labor. For corporations, it was the perfect loophole, a workforce that couldn't unionize, couldn't strike, and couldn't leave. For Victoria's Secret, it meant cheap production at a time when the brand was expanding aggressively. But how much did they really know? Were they complicit or simply indifferent? Some investigators argue the company looked away, preferring not to ask hard questions, so long as the supply chain delivered. Others suggest something more sinister, that Victoria's Secret deliberately buried links to prison labor once the story surfaced, quietly shifting contracts while denying everything. Today, Victoria's Secret markets empowerment, beauty, and confidence. But for many former inmates, the memory of sewing lingerie under threat of punishment is hard to forget. The lingerie that symbolized freedom and fantasy was, for them, a reminder of confinement. And that's the paradox at the heart of this story. A brand built on the promise of intimacy and luxury, hiding a history of forced labor. A secret buried not in satin or lace, but in prison workshops where the machines never stopped clattering. So the question remains, how much of Victoria's Secret's success was stitched together by women who had no choice but to obey? Gucci, Murder in the Family. It's a cool spring morning in Milan, 1995. The air smells faintly of rain as Maurizio Gucci, last heir to the Gucci empire, walks into the courtyard of his office on Via Palestro. He's holding papers in one hand, lost in thought. A man steps forward, raises a revolver, and fires. 4 gunshots echo off the marble walls. Maurizio collapses onto the stone steps, blood pooling beneath him. For the world, it's a shocking crime. The head of one of fashion's most glamorous dynasties murdered in broad daylight. But for insiders, it's the climax of a family saga already poisoned by betrayal, greed, and whispers of conspiracy. Almost immediately, suspicion turns to his ex-wife, Patrizia Reggiani. Known in the tabloids as the Black Widow, she's flamboyant, sharp-tongued, and unrepentant. Investigators trace the crime back to her. She ordered the hit, paying hired gunmen through intermediaries. But why? Patrizia was already receiving a generous divorce settlement, yet she famously declared she would rather be a widow than poor. Was it really just greed? Or was there something darker beneath the surface? Rage at being excluded from the empire, fear of losing the status Gucci gave her, or perhaps knowledge of secrets Maurizio planned to reveal? Behind the glossy facade, the Gucci family was tearing itself apart. Infighting, lawsuits, and financial scandals plagued the brand throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Maurizio himself had been ousted from the company only a few years earlier, after lavish spending nearly bankrupted the empire. He was living on borrowed money, clinging to the Gucci name while trying to rebuild. Patrizia, meanwhile, was furious. Once the queen of Milan's high society, she found herself increasingly sidelined. Friends recalled how she spoke openly of killing Maurizio, joking, or perhaps warning, that his days were numbered. Yet even with her reputation, it took years before investigators could pin the crime on her. Was Patrizia shielded by powerful allies in the fashion world? Whispers spread through Milan that influential figures delayed or buried parts of the investigation. Gucci, after all, wasn't just a brand. It was an institution, one that brought Italy global prestige and billions in revenue. A scandal tying its name to a contract killing could have been devastating. Some claim evidence was quietly suppressed, or that witnesses hesitated to speak out for fear of crossing the wrong people. Others believe Patrizia herself knew too much about financial irregularities, tax evasion, or the secret lives of the wealthy elite. To silence her might have risked less exposure than allowing her to sit publicly in the role of the vengeful widow. When the trial finally came, it was a media circus. Cameras swarmed the courthouse. Patrizia arrived in furs and jewels, treating the proceedings like a catwalk. She never denied her involvement outright, but she framed herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming she'd been manipulated by psychics and false friends. The jury didn't buy it. She was sentenced to 29 years in prison, yet even behind bars, Patrizia remained unrepentant. Asked years later why she didn't want to kill Maurizio herself, she replied coolly, "My eyesight is not so good. I didn't want to miss." Maurizio's murder ripped away the last illusion of Gucci as a family empire. The brand survived, but only after being sold off to outside investors. And so the question lingers, hidden beneath layers of silk and leather. Was this simply the story of a bitter ex-wife's revenge? Or did the Gucci empire itself bury deeper crimes behind a curtain of fashion and blood? Coca-Cola and death squads in Latin America. It's Colombia, late 1990s. A union leader straightens his shirt, kisses his children goodbye, and steps out of his modest home. He walks toward the local Coca-Cola bottling plant, where he has spent years organizing workers demanding safer conditions and fair wages. But before he reaches the gates, a motorcycle screeches around the corner. Two masked men leap off, pistols raised. 4 shots crack through the morning air. The leader collapses onto the dirt road. His children will later find his lunchbox lying in the dust, unopened. He is not the first. He will not be the last. During these years, Colombia was caught between guerrilla fighters, paramilitary death squads, and multinational corporations desperate to protect their profits. Coca-Cola, the world's most recognizable brand, had deep roots in the country. But with those roots came blood. Workers who tried to unionize, who dared to challenge conditions inside bottling plants, began turning up dead. Some were gunned down outside factory gates. Others were dragged from their homes at night and never seen again. Were Coca-Cola's bottling plants complicit in using paramilitary death squads to silence their workers? The lawsuits that followed told a chilling story. Families of the victims accused plant managers of colluding with local militias. Testimonies claimed threats were delivered openly. Stop organizing or pay with your life. Coca-Cola's official line was simple. It had no control over its independent bottlers. The violence, they said, was a tragedy of Colombia's civil conflict, not the company's doing. But survivors painted a darker picture. According to their accounts, some plant executives attended private meetings with paramilitary commanders. Envelopes of cash exchanged hands. Lists of problem workers were quietly circulated. Which raises the sinister question: did the world's most famous drink turn a blind eye or play an active role in bloodshed? The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, dozens of union leaders tied to Coca-Cola bottlers were killed, threatened, or disappeared. International human rights groups raised alarms. Protests spread from Bogota to New York to Berlin. Students called for boycotts, chanting that every Coke bottle carried the taste of blood. Yet Coca-Cola remained untouchable. Its marketing juggernaut drowned out criticism with images of polar bears, Christmas trucks, and the promise of happiness in a red can. Few mainstream outlets wanted to dwell on the story. The brand was too powerful, too deeply woven into global culture, and the deeper investigators dug, the stranger it became. Some allege that U.S. diplomats quietly discouraged inquiries, fearing destabilization of a key ally in the war on drugs. Others whispered that intelligence agencies monitored the case, wary that exposing corporate complicity might backfire geopolitically. To this day, the lawsuits remain entangled in technicalities. Courts have often ruled that Coca-Cola's global headquarters could not be held legally accountable for the actions of its bottlers. No executive has ever faced prison time, but for the families of the dead, the legal maneuvers mean little. They remember the motorcycles, the gunmen, the funerals. They remember the laughter of their children silenced by grief. And they remember the Coca-Cola logo painted in bright red on the factory wall. Looming over it all, was this simply the chaos of Colombia's civil war seeping into the workplace? Or was the world's most beloved soft drink a silent partner in terror, its profits flowing smoothly while death moved in the shadows?